The demonstrators in Liberation Square still renewing their calls for Hosni Mubarak to leave, rejecting his efforts to remain in office for another few months. The ongoing political crisis leaves Egypt's economy in jeopardy. It's already costing the country $310 million every day. How much more can the country take? And what needs to be done to solve the long-running economic crisis once and for all? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. As protests continue in Egypt, the economy is taking a hard hit. And while economic discontent was once the driving force behind the recent unrest, economists estimate the Egyptian economy has lost $3 billion so far because of the crisis. Let's take a quick look. In an effort to dissuade the demonstrators, the cabinet now says it'll increase state sector salaries by 15%. But where will it get the money from? Tourism has been hard hit and so has business. The Credit Agricole Bank says the protests are costing Egypt more than $300 million a day. The country's industry ministry says that there was a 6% drop in exports in January as banks and businesses were shut down. And the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development believes that Egypt has lost $90 million alone from having the internet taken offline for days. With some banks open, the Egyptian pound has strengthened on Tuesday, but that came after dropping to a 6-year low on Monday, and this appears just to be the tip of the iceberg. For more on this, joining me on today's programme are my three guests from the Saudi capital of Riyadh: John Safkianakis, Chief Economist from Banque Saudi Fransi; from Boston, Eric Cheney, Assistant Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Mr. Cheney specialises in the history of political transitions in Egypt, economic history and political economy of the Arab Islamic world. And also joining us on the phone from Cairo in Tahrir Square is Ghouda Abdel-Khalek, an economics professor at Cairo University. Abdel-Khalek is also head of the Economic Committee for Tag Amu, the Progressive National Alliance, a left-wing opposition group. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. John, can I start with you in Riyadh? If Egypt's economy was in the doldrums before the crisis, how bad is it really now?
Well, definitely all of this is not helping the Egyptian economy, and it's going to look far worse than it is today if we continue to have political uncertainty, violence, tourists leaving, remittances not being sent to Egypt, and the trade flow between the outside world and Egypt is slowing down. If this continues, definitely that is going to have an impact, a severe impact on the Egyptian economy.
Eric, could I ask you the same question in Boston?
So the question, I think that's right. That these temporary kind of shocks that we're having right now, if they continue for a long time, could get a little bit more out of hand. It should be noted too, though, that the international community has a real interest in making sure that things don't get too bad. So I think you also have to take that into account.
Ghouda Abdel-Khalek, who's on the phone in Cairo. In terms of the reality of how bad is it on the ground, can you tell me, are the basics such as bread, milk, clean water, electricity, are you able to get those things, or do people have to go outside of Cairo to get their daily supplies?
No. I would like to differ with the story as portrayed from a distance with the other speakers. The situation here on the ground is quite different. In Tahrir Square, you get a very strong feeling that the whole nation is in a process of great transformation. And that's going to factor into the economic performance of this country over the medium to long term. This is point number one. Point number two, let's not forget, you made mention of the international organizations. It was the international organizations, specifically the fund and the bank, that drove Egypt into this situation, which resulted in the breakout of events January 25th. So I think one of the lessons that we should heed now is never listen to the advice, the economic advice provided by the international economic organizations, particularly the fund and the bank, because they don't really know what's going on the ground. Now, when it comes to daily life of the Egyptians, there are some hardships, of course, but there is no shortage of bread or milk or daily necessities. You don't have to travel even. You have to leave your own quarter to fetch such necessities in other places. I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the extent of hardship that Egyptians are undergoing right now. But I would like to say that you may easily misread the economic reality of Egypt if you view it through the eyes of foreign communities.
Well, nobody wants to over-exaggerate it, but we certainly do want to get the facts on the ground. If I can just bring in John Safkianakis in Riyadh. There we heard Mr. Ghouda Abdel-Khalek saying, don't listen to the international community. It's perhaps not as bad as it could be. Can I then just ask, what's happening at the moment in Egypt is affecting everything. Imports, exports, tourism, investment. The stock market is closed at the moment, opens in a few days' time. What's it going to take to get the economy back on its feet when everybody is saying this is really damaging Egypt economically?
Well, it's clearly confidence. It's clearly investments, both local and international. FDI will be impacted if this situation continues. The tourists, you need them because they account for nearly 6% of Egypt's GDP. They brought about $12 billion last year. So if that doesn't come in, if half of these tourists do not come in, then you won't have the tourist receipts. And definitely, if you don't have the confidence, then the amount of borrowing that Egypt has to do will increase, but also the price that it has to pay will increase. If international investors bail out of the stock market and there is a capital outflow, then you will have a continuous depreciation of the Egyptian pound, and that is a real problem. So it all depends. But of course, the realities on the ground differ, because when Egypt was growing at 6 and 7%, or more likely 5 to 6%, I would say, the real impact on the average Egyptian was negligible.
Well, if that is the case, Eric, can I just bring you in from Boston? If you could put this into context for us, because obviously Egypt is going through the mill at the moment, but it has done in the past. It's had military coups before. It's had a king deposed. I mean, how bad is the situation now compared to its historical experiences?
Well, I mean, if you take a long view of history, especially before the building of the Aswan Dam, Egypt's agricultural produce was very much dependent on Nile floods. And so severe temporary economic shocks are not something that's that rare historically in Egypt, nor these severe temporary the effects of these severe temporary economic shocks, that is, increasing the number of people who are willing to publicly riot. So, this kind of short-term shock is historically not abnormal. What happens from this shock, where we go from here, might be different than what has happened historically in these periods, but definitely periods of economic downturn are not abnormal historically.
Ghouda Abdel-Khalek in Cairo, sir, for decades the decisions that have been made about the Egyptian people have benefited those at the top, you might say, and the large majority of people have not benefited from the wealth generation from exports of cotton or even tourism. How do you expect the people now to want to see the pie divided so they get an equal share?
Well, let me put it like this. Now, the Egyptians are struggling to rework the political equation in the country and put in place a more just and equitable system where there is equality of opportunity and where Egyptians will no longer be subjects but citizens. I repeat, not subjects but citizens. That is a very important point. Now, if you're dealing with citizens, then it's a totally different kettle of fish when it comes to dividing the pie. The situation has been over the past 30 years is that the fruits of economic growth, if you like, were actually kept by a very privileged few, and these are the people who are struggling hard to transfer their fortunes abroad. When it comes to the daily life of the Egyptians, I would say that the importance of the importance of the informal sector I think we heard the estimate of the French bank, about $320 million a day. That's a bit exaggerated because it doesn't look at the other side of the coin, which is the significance of the informal sector in the Egyptian economy. What's happening now is a financial shock and a shock to some other sectors, particularly tourism. But I would like to say, back in January 2003, 8 years today, the Egyptian pound took quite a tumbling, much, much greater than what it took over the past few days here in Egypt. And the result was not like popular uprising, people taking to the streets, but a silly decision taken by the government on the advice of the international institutions. And this is why I'd like to say, for heaven's sake, let us stop reading the fortunes of Egypt through the eyes of foreigners, and let's try and make the effort to read the fortunes of Egypt through the eyes of Egyptians. If we do that, we, I think, can look forward for a bright future for this country when Egyptians regain their own decisions and take things in their own hands.
Okay.
I'm not saying that it's a rosy picture, but I'm saying that it's wrong to exaggerate what's happening. Nobody knows how long this thing is going to take. Nobody knows how far and wide and deep it's going to develop. But so far, I think there is no need for this scare at all.
Okay, well, let me just bring in John Safkianakis in Riyadh. Of course, Egypt has a rosy future, according to Mr. Khalek there in Cairo. But what was the Mubarak government trying to do, if anything, to make the situation better, considering there was a global economic downturn? And was it just too little too late? And hence, we have the situation now.
The problems of the Egyptian economy are deep and structural. It doesn't have to do with what Mubarak and the government did or didn't do over the last 5 years. These are deep structural problems that go back to the 1990s, even in the 1980s. And I would say that in many ways, they go back to the 1950s when the industry was nationalized and you had an exodus of people who were entrepreneurs. In many ways, the entrepreneurial class of Egypt was destroyed since the 50s. So as a result, today you have a system where it is semi-capitalist and semi-socialist. You might disagree. Some of them might say that this is not the case. But here I would say that definitely the problems that you have in Egypt today have to do with the neglect that the government placed in terms of creating a more equitable system for the brunt or the majority of the Egyptians, and not certainly the elite that benefited from that. The middle class in Egypt shrunk over the last 10 years exponentially. The Gini coefficient or poverty levels did not necessarily decrease, but of course certain indicators show that they increased. So that is an issue. And by all means, over the last few days, the problems that Egypt faced was a problem of any globalized economy. That is, when you invite foreigners, when they see danger, they tend to leave. And that is quite real. And I would highlight also that the problems that the Egyptian economy face are requiring decisions to take place and results to be seen over generations. These are not going to be fixed very quickly. The Egyptian pound today increased in value because the government intervened, and the government will continue to intervene because it wants to see a stronger Egyptian pound.
Well, that is the case. Good at Abdel-Khalek in Cairo, sir. To improve the situation, if that possibly can be done economically, and considering what John said in Riyadh, there is this interconnection between the politics and the economy, and some might say that the politics of the country have been run by people who were perhaps not best positioned, i.e. military men. To a certain extent, there were also some very strong business leaders as well. I mean, why was that combination unworkable?
Well, because this is what I call crony capitalism. It has nothing to do with economic efficiency. It has nothing to do with social justice. It's a bunch of people highly connected to places of power, adamant on spoiling the Egyptians. That's what went on decade after decade since this man took office, and even before him during the days of Sadat. Now, what to do? My own reading is that against the backdrop of what's happening in Tahrir Square and elsewhere in other Egyptian cities, we, I think, have taken a big step to root out corruption and to de-link capital from power and authority. If we eventually succeed in severing that link, which I think was vicious, devious, and devilish at the same time. And you just think about the businessmen who took ministerial positions, and everybody now is talking about the fortunes they have amassed at the expense of the livelihood of ordinary Egyptians. So I'm saying that this everybody has woken up to the brutal fact that the policies, neoliberal policies that were propagated by the fund and the bank, led Egypt into this difficult situation that it's finding itself in right now. And there is a good deal of soul-searching, soul-searching rethinking going on.
Sure.
Now, the government is struggling to deal with this situation by giving handouts. That is equally dangerous, because if you just contented with giving handouts without mobilizing real resources, for example, they had a social raise, 15%.
Well,
now, if you don't mobilize real resources to finance that, the end result would be a widening fiscal deficit and accumulating domestic debt, and that's not going to solve the problem.
Well, maybe that problem is just a little bit more deep-seated. John Safkianakis, on the surface, people are looking at what's going on in Egypt and thinking, right, the economy is affected, tourism, Suez Canal, lots of business goes through there. It's a problem not just for Egypt, but for Middle Eastern countries who, if you look at the Middle East, they are not huge manufacturing centres like Europe or the Far East, and therefore they can't always provide the aspirations and goals that young people actually want. And this is one of the innate problems of what's been going on, is it not, over North Africa and the Middle East recently with the many demonstrations that we've seen?
You're right. For sure, the economic project of the Middle East has not created the necessary jobs. But at the same time, we had a demographic dynamic that was very difficult to match, meaning that we had a lot of people to cater for. Egypt today, for instance, is a country of 83 million people, and you will not be able to fix immediately the structural problems by creating jobs, because you're not creating enough jobs. So I would say that for the whole Middle East, yes, it hasn't been able to find its competitive edge. And that's where we have these problems. At the core, the problems that many of these countries in the Middle East face are distributional problems, problems that have to do with the economies that have not been well run. They have governance issues. Certain elites have been benefiting for a long time, and there is no social welfare. And as a result, you have what you have today, in addition to the politics and what have you. But at the end of the day, if you look at the Middle East and the map, it is better than Africa in comparative terms, but worse than Asia in many other emerging markets. And the Middle East has not been able to discover its place in the global economy.
OK, well, let's just take this on a little bit, and perhaps if you'll indulge me, gentlemen, a little bit of role-playing here. Mr. Abdel-Khalek, imagine I am President Mubarak. I'm still in power. I have to get the economy back on track while the world watches Egypt's economy slide. Tourism gone, Suez Canal worries. I need inward investment. Who is going to help me and why?
Well, inward investment, if you want to, you're telling me that I need, as President of Egypt, to attract foreign investment into the country to get things going, right? Is that your question?
That's right.
Well, yeah, I beg to differ. This is the point. People here, decision makers, have always insisted that the only difference that we need to make is
No, but if I'm President
have
Mubarak,
a-
if I'm President Mubarak right now, who in the outside world would want to help me? Is there anybody?
Well, you put the question to President Mubarak, not to me, but because for one thing, many people are unhappy with him because of his stalling tactics when it comes to political transformation. So, and that shows the close link between politics and economic interests.
Okay.
But if I were in the seat of President Mubarak, I wouldn't worry very much about foreign investment. I would try to mobilize domestic and local resources of Egypt, which are so many. But the trouble was that they kept all the time looking for outside solutions to the country's plight, and with rampant corruption everywhere.
Sure. I'm just trying to get a sense of. I'm just trying to get a sense of where Egypt goes now. I'll come back to you straight now because I just want to get a real ballpark figure of what's going on. John Safkianis, I'm President Mubarak. Who's going to help me financially in this particular situation?
Well, I think definitely you will have to go to the international markets. You will have to issue more of your bonds. You will pay more for it. But also, if there is an emergency, you will have to go to the IMF and the World Bank and the countries that are able to provide you fiscal support. The Gulf countries could be those, and the EU, of course. Not forget that Egypt is very close to the EU, and what was done for Turkey could be done for Egypt in many ways.
But doesn't that cause a problem for people like the IMF and the EU, even the United States perhaps, of not wanting to be seen supporting a man who is, you might say, on a downward slope, because they'd only be accused of helping, you know, somebody that might be described as a dictator or a thug or a bully?
Well, you're right, but here they have to save the Egyptian economy, so they don't have a choice. It's not an issue of saving President Mubarak, but it's saving more Egypt and the economy of Egypt and the Egyptians. So they don't have a choice but to support whatever they can, and the IMF has indicated that, and they will do it over and over again.
Mr. Ghouda Abdel-Khalek in Cairo, the situation is still very tense in Egypt, across the country. We can talk about the economy forever and a day, but how do you see this all ending if it is going to end peacefully?
Okay, let me just make a comment on the last speaker, because he said Egypt should go to the International Monetary Fund. I would like to caution that this is business as usual and more of the same. And it's a recipe for disaster, because every place the IMF has been, we know the end result. Actually, the outburst that we're witnessing in Egypt right now is the logical conclusion of following methodically the policy prescriptions of the Bretton Woods institution. We need a totally different medicine to take the situation. Coming to your last point that you just made, I'm very hopeful. But hopeful over the medium and long run, because Egypt's crucial problem doesn't lie in the economy, but lies more in the nature of the political system. It's a very authoritarian, coercive, corruptive. It doesn't heed any advice from inside the country. It relies on Western and foreign advisors to advise on all of issues. And in fact, let's not forget that what triggers this event in Egypt right now is this blatant rigging of the parliamentary election, which went on back in late November and early December last year. So it's here that's where we should start, and it's here where I see what's happening in Egypt right now.
Sure.
in very positive terms.
Okay.
Yes, just an economic cost to it, but the political and economic rewards down the line are very important, and they're going to make a difference for Egypt.
Well, we shall see whether they do make a difference or not. Now, unfortunately, we do have to leave it. I'd like to thank my guests in Riyadh, John Safkianakis, in Cairo, Ghouda Abdel-Khalek, who was on the phone, and in Boston, Eric Cheney. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.com. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks very much for your time and your company.